Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you all, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to this week's edition of the M&E Thursday Talks on DME for Peace. Just in case you've forgotten, or for those of you who are new to the Thursday Talks, my name is Jack Farrell, and I am the DME for Peace Project Manager at Search for Common Ground, calling in today from London. Today, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Jeff Conroy-Krutz, Professor of Political Science at Michigan State University, who's going to present on measuring the effects of media, bringing in some lessons from Niger. Just a note, if you have a question during the webinar, you can write it in the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard, and we will address it once we reach the discussion portion of today's webinar. I'll now hand over to today's guest. Jeff, you're very welcome to the Thursday Talks. Take it away.
Thank you so much. Greetings from snowy Michigan, US. I want to thank Jack and also Jennifer for inviting me to participate in this really neat group. I have been studying, as a political scientist, I've been studying media throughout the developing world, but particularly in Africa for my pretty much my entire career. And I'm really interested in the effects that media have on politics, but I'm also really interested in thinking about and studying how we study the effects that media have on political outcomes and development outcomes and a whole range of social political outcomes. So I'm really excited to have this opportunity to share some of my thoughts today and to get feedback, comments, questions, and critiques. I think it's pretty clear that there's a lot of interest in media and how media affects all kinds of outcomes. And there's lots of actors who obviously use media to try to have particular effects. Those actors can range from politicians and political parties to governments and non-governmental organizations. So there's a lot of interest in this because folks know that you can reach a broad audience, obviously, through mass media. So there's a potential for a big effect. But as social scientists and folks who are using media to try to achieve certain outcomes, it can be challenging to identify what the particular effects of a media program are. And these challenges stem from a few reasons. One in which is that it can be hard to identify who the actual audience is, who is actually listening to a particular program or who's watching a particular program. There's a lot of literature in academia that suggests that people are very bad at remembering or recalling exactly what kinds of messages they've been exposed to. So audience surveys, which many of us do, can encounter some kinds of challenges here. But beyond that, even if we knew with perfect precision who was being exposed to our program, we have an additional challenge here, which is determining like a causal effect of that program, right? So if we're interested in doing M&E work, this is a big question. We might see in, for example, a survey, a strong positive correlation between exposure, self-reported exposure to a certain program and some kind of outcome of interest, whether that be a knowledge outcome, an attitudinal outcome, a behavioral outcome, right? And we might conclude, therefore, that the exposure to the program is what's driving that outcome, and therefore the program is being effective, or is being effective in the wrong direction, right? But everyone probably knows where I'm going with this, right? That these kinds of correlational studies can lead us down an errant path, right? Because correlation doesn't equal causality. We might have the problem of reverse causality. And this is an especially large problem. This is a problem in all social sciences and all monitoring and evaluation work, but it's particularly a problem with media because people self-select what media they would like to be exposed to in most circumstances. And so that strong positive correlation that we might see between exposure and certain outcomes might be that the media are determining those outcomes, or it might be that people who already have certain kinds of knowledge, attitudes, and behavior are self-selecting into that programming. So we have to disentangle this if we want to know whether the programming is effective or not. In the social sciences, one of the most common strategies, and this is increasingly a common strategy or set of strategies for folks more broadly doing M&E work, is to use experimentation, because experimentation gets around these potential problems of people self-selecting into a program or a treatment, right? But experiments are very challenging to do with regards to media, because how do you specifically expose certain people to certain messages? And there are lots of different kinds of experimental or quasi-experimental methods that have been used to attempt to measure the effectiveness of media on certain outcomes. I've tried a lot of these experimental methodologies myself. I'm happy to talk in the Q&A about any one of them. They all have their pros and they all have their cons, right? So you could set up artificial listening groups and have some groups listen to one program or watch one program and other groups not. You could randomize stations and do an experiment that way. You could do laboratory experiments where you bring people into an artificial setting and ask them to watch or listen to or read a certain kind of message. You could do other kinds of field experiments. You could do like a quasi-experimental kind of thing where you do some statistical matching to try to get equivalent groups. But the experimental methodology that I want to talk about today is this last one on the list, which is encouragement experiments. And I'm going to argue that this is a potential strategy that folks who are interested in measuring the effects of media, but not necessarily just media. It could be used to measure the effects of a range of different kinds of programs. That this is a kind of strategy that has a lot of promise, but is somewhat underutilized. And so what I'd like to do in the talk today is lay out the basics of this strategy, use it as an entree to talk about other kinds of experimental strategies in monitoring and evaluation as it refers to media effects more specifically, give an example from a project that I worked on last year in Niger, and then talk about the potential benefits of this kind of strategy, but also the potential limitations. I'm not going to try to sell this kind of strategy or any other kind of experimental strategy or any other kind of monitoring and evaluation strategy as a panacea. There are pros and cons of each, and I hope to be able to have a discussion about those. So particularly, I want to talk about how we set up a particular kind of encouragement design known as a symmetric encouragement design. And I want to lay out the basics of this and how it works. So let's say we have a program that we are interested in studying the effects of. I'm going to call this the focus program, and for shorthand, I'm going to refer to it as treatment 1 or T1. And so in a normal encouragement design, what we would do is we would encourage people to listen to this program. And I'll talk about how we do that encouragement in a bit. In a symmetric encouragement design, we have another group operating at the same time. And this other group is a group of subjects who are recruited not to listen to or watch the program of focus, but they are instructed to or encouraged to listen to or watch another program. We're going to refer to this as a placebo program or T2. And there are two really important fundamentals that should drive all symmetric encouragement designs. Right? The first one is common to pretty much all experiments, which is that the assignment of an individual or a group to either the focus or the placebo in this case should be randomly determined, because if assignment is randomly determined and if the groups are large enough, then theoretically those two groups should be statistically equivalent. They should be equal in every way except for one group is exposed to the focus program and the other group is exposed to the placebo program. So that's a basic of experimental design. The other component is where we bring in the symmetric part, right? So the other important component of this kind of design is that both the focus program and the placebo program have to be broadcast simultaneously. So if they're radio programs or television programs, they need to be broadcast simultaneously. And why this is important is because if people who are assigned to the focus program comply, they follow the encouragement, by design, they can therefore not be exposed to the placebo program. And more importantly, from our perspective, the people who are assigned to the placebo program, if they're following the protocols, cannot, by definition, for the period of the study, whether it be a month or 3 months, cannot be exposed to the focus program. And what that allows us to do is to set up a really, what we might call, clean experiment, where we have one group of people who are, for a given period, exposed to the focus program, and we can compare them to another group of people who we can be fairly confident are during that study period not exposed to the focus program. And then if we want to measure the effects of the focus program, it's just a simple comparison in outcomes between the focus program and the placebo program. So what we're doing in essence is taking a methodology that's used very commonly in laboratory or artificial settings and taking it to, quote unquote, the field or the real world, and getting nice treatment and control groups there that allow us to do a comparison and differences in outcomes. So one big challenge, there are a couple challenges that go along with these kinds of symmetric encouragement designs, but a big challenge is, how do we try to maximize our subjects complying with what they have been encouraged to do? Because if subjects are not complying, then we don't have these clean treatment and control groups, and it messes up the entire study. And of course, this is an encouragement design, right? We're not forcing people to listen to or watch certain programs. That would, of course, be unethical. So how can we encourage them to comply with their assignment, whether it be the focus program or a placebo program? There are a couple ways we can go about doing this. One would be, we would assign the program to the subject when we recruit them, so they know what's expected of them when they sign up for the study. And if they're not interested, they don't have to participate in the study. The second thing would be to send them regular reminders, SMS, phone calls, maybe face-to-face visits, reminding them, if it's a weekly program, for example, to tune in X day at X time on X station to listen to the program that they've been assigned to. And the third component that is pretty universal in these kinds of experiments is to somehow incentivize listening, right? So this is usually done by telling subjects upon recruitment what they're expected to listen to or watch, and then telling them that they are going to have opportunities to be quizzed. Maybe it's once a week, maybe it's once every 2 weeks, however the design is set up. And we're going to ask them factual questions about what they've heard or what they've watched. And if they get a certain number of questions right, they will get some kind of reward. It might be a financial reward. You can design the rewards however you'd like. It should be something, right, that the subjects are going to value. And hopefully they also find the program that they've been assigned to listen to or watch somewhat interesting, and that's going to incentivize them to comply as well. And so at the end, we can talk about whether this, to the extent to which these kinds of incentives actually work. There are a few examples that have been published in the academic literature of studies that have used this kind of symmetric encouragement design, some done in the United States with regards to measuring the effects of watching a mayoral debate, another done in South Africa, where young people were encouraged to watch one version of one soap opera program that was intended to spread messages about debt management and gambling, and then another kind of placebo soap opera program that broadcast at the same time, and then a study with secondary school students in Tanzania through an edutainment program that was aimed at increasing entrepreneurship skills. And I've searched, and I haven't found that many other examples of these kinds of symmetric encouragement designs being utilized. And so I'm going to put forth the argument that there's a lot of possibility here, that this is an underutilized potential M&E tool that, as I'm going to argue, has potential benefits. So I'd like to talk about an example of an encouragement design that I had the opportunity to participate in. And this was a study of a radio discussion program in Niger. The particular program is called Le Forum, and it's part of a broader set of programs known as Studio Kalungu, which is a project of the Swiss organization Fondation Hirondelle. And I was fortunate to receive funding for this evaluation from the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the US Department of State, which was interested in studying different kinds of evaluation strategies. I should, of course, offer the caveat that anything I say is not reflective of the positions of any branch of the US government, nor is it reflective of Studio Kalungu or Fundación Irondel. I really did work on this evaluation separately. I knew of Irondel's work. I found it really compelling and interesting. I wanted to have an opportunity to evaluate it. These funds came along and Irondel was sort of like, okay, that's fine, go ahead and do it if you'd like. But any mistakes, critiques are on me. I don't want to portray this as some kind of necessary partnership between me and anyone else. So as a political scientist, I was interested in how exposure to discussion programs like Le Forum affect various outcomes, people's knowledge about and interested in politics, their sense of personal efficacy, how much they can affect change, how much they are participating in politics or their interest in participating in politics, and also how tolerant they are of quote unquote others and their attitudinal moderation. In this particular project, I utilized what I call modified symmetric encouragement design. So in addition to the treatment that focused on the program of interest, Le Forum, we also had a treatment that used a placebo, and then finally we had a control of individuals who were not encouraged to listen to either the placebo program or Le Forum. I'm happy to talk in the Q&A about why I included a control group. I think it's a great idea if you can afford it, but it's not absolutely necessary. We had 400 subjects who were randomly assigned to each of these encouragements, or in the control, the absence of an encouragement. One of the biggest challenges that we encountered in this study was identifying what the placebo program was. So we obviously knew what the program of interest was, but identifying the placebo was a little more challenging than I had expected. And that's because the placebo program has to meet certain criteria. It has to obviously be broadcast in the same time slot as the focus program. It should broadcast with the same degree of frequency. So if your program of focus broadcasts once a week, the placebo program should also broadcast once a week. If it broadcasts every day, then subject assigned to the placebo can say, well, I'll just listen to the placebo program on Thursday and I'll listen to the focus program on Tuesday. And you haven't created that really clear separation that you want in this kind of experiment. They should be operating in the same geographic area, and they should utilize the same language. That's so that you get the same kinds of subject pools so that you can compare them appropriately. And finally, the placebo program has to be informational, right? We encountered a lot of potential programs that were solely music, which is normally fine, but if you want to incentivize people to listen through quizzes, it's very hard to quiz people about, what music did you hear on a radio program a week ago? So we wanted it to be something that provides some kind of information, not political information of the type that, or the kind of social information that Le Forum was supposed to provide, but it should be something that's conducive to quizzing people about. So we eventually narrowed in on one radio station that broadcast Le Forum and another radio station that broadcast at the same time. We focused on Saturday evening programs that broadcast in the Hausa language. At the same time broadcast it was like a cultural program where they were interview artists about their biographies. And we thought this was a great, very separate from the kind of thing that Le Forum was doing, but conducive to quizzing people about. Both of these radio stations were located in the town of Maradi, which is on the sort of south central part of Niger, as you can see here along the border with Nigeria. And we had a mix of urban and rural respondents. So to briefly go over the steps that were involved in the study, once we had identified the placebo program and identified where we were going to work, we randomly selected localities. After selecting the localities, we randomly selected households, and then within those households, we randomly selected subjects. Those subjects had to meet certain criteria to be eligible, which is something I'll come back to talking about at the very end when I talk about pros and cons. Then we did a baseline study after recruiting people. Then we the incentivization period lasted 6 weeks. So we did 3 bi-weekly quizzes. And then we conducted the end line, which is basically the same as the baseline, and then compared the differences in responses from baseline to end line. So what I want to wrap things up with is a discussion of what we found, not the substantive findings. I don't want to talk about what effects we found of Le Forum on the outcomes of interest for 3 reasons. One is time. The second reason is I'm not completely done with the analyses, and I'd like to share them first with Hirondelle and the donor. And the last reason is I view this as an opportunity to talk about the methodology first and foremost. So I'd like to talk about how I feel the methodology worked. So one concern is that with a kind of study in which you are working with people over time, any kind of panel study, right, and that there's going to be a lot of recontact, as there was in our case, that subjects are going to drop out. You're going to have high rates of attrition, and this could mess up your study in various ways. And we budgeted for attrition, but we were very pleased to see that we had very low rates of attrition. About 88% of people who participated in the baseline also participated in the end line, which exceeded our expectations. So that worked well. And I think it was because of these incentivizations that I'll talk about in a bit. Now, we did have a bit of a skewed sample, and this is not a problem with the particulars of the encouragement design. It was just a function of the context that we were working in. All our subjects had to be, in order to participate, they had to have regular access to a radio, they had to have regular access to a mobile phone, and they had to regularly use mobile money, which is how we sent the payments. It turns out that, and this is something that didn't come up until after we collected the baseline data, something I should have been on top of more, but it's very hard in rural Niger, where women are particularly marginalized, to have women who meet all those criteria. And so the enumerators were basically fudging the process and mainly recruiting men, because those are the only people they could find who were eligible. So the subjects skewed heavily male. And finally, in terms of compliance, which is a big concern, right? If people aren't listening to the programs or watching the programs that they're assigned to, then it's going to mess up our ability to actually compare the groups adequately. You lose that cleanness in the treatment versus the placebo or the control. And here I was personally pretty pleased with what we found. About 62% of people who completed the first quiz after 2 weeks answered enough questions correctly that they earned a reward. And after the second quiz, 64% did. And it's really also nice to be able to say there were no statistically significant differences between the people who were assigned to the placebo and the focus program here. I'm happy to talk in the Q&A about what we do about the people who don't appear to have complied, like how you treat them in the analyses, because there's various types of thought on this. So to wrap up, I want to talk about what I think are the pros and cons, or the pros and limitations, I should say, about encouragement designs, because all evaluation strategies have advantages and disadvantages. The biggest pro of an encouragement design I see is that you can kind of create or attempt to create the types of clean treatment and placebo or control groups that you can achieve in a laboratory, but you can take that to the real world, and that will allow you to be able to estimate with precision what are the actual causal effects, the impact of your media programming. Another benefit is that subjects aren't listening to the programming or watching the programming in a laboratory in an artificial setting. They're doing it probably in the settings that they would normally be exposed to these kinds of programs. And that gives us a little more confidence that they're responding to the media programming similarly to the way that they might respond in the quote-unquote real world. We can measure exposure over a longer period of time than you can usually measure in a laboratory experiment. You might bring people in and say, hey, listen to this 30-minute program, and then you measure the immediate effects. With encouragement design, and this is important because most organizations' theories of change will suggest that it's repeated or regular exposure to a program or a message that's going to change knowledge, attitudes, or behavior. And encouragement design allows you to do that over a longer period of time. And finally, one potential benefit of encouragement designs that has not been explored yet, to my knowledge, is that it actually allows you to achieve efficiencies, because you can evaluate 2 programs at once, right? So you could pair up with another organization that also does media-based programming, and their program is the placebo, and your program is the program of interest. From their perspective, their program is the program of interest and your program is the placebo. So there's a lot of opportunities for efficiency gains through this kind of design. But I said at the outset, I didn't want to portray this as a panacea. There are some limitations to this kind of design. And so I'd like to run through some of what those limitations are. The first is that although subjects are probably listening to the program in quote unquote the real world, right, in an environment in which they would normally be listening to or watching the program, it's just inherently artificial that in the real world, people don't recruit us to watch particular programs or listen to particular programs, and they don't pay us to do so and quiz us. And so there is some slippage there, right, between how people consume media in the real world and how they're doing it in an encouragement kind of design. Another limitation is you can't guarantee compliance, right? There is going to be some gap between what people are assigned to do and what people do. And again, I'm happy to talk in the Q&A about how we deal with that gap. But if you find that a huge proportion of people who are participating in your study are not complying, then that's a big problem. So you need to incentivize them. A challenge, though, is that those incentivizations can be costly. They add to your budget, right? Particularly if you're doing some kind of financial reward. They don't have to be huge. Probably they shouldn't be huge, but it's still an added cost. This kind of design does not work well for programs that are very short in nature and that broadcast frequently. So public service announcements, for example, or short sketches, things that might take 30 seconds or 2 minutes that are broadcast several times over a day on radio or television. It's impossible in my mind. I can't think of how you would use an encouragement design to achieve a measurement of those kinds of programs. And finally, unless you're actually working with the organization that produces the placebo program, you can't fully control what the nature of that placebo program is. And we encountered this in Niger. After we recruited the subjects and started the study, we found out that the placebo program, the station that was running it, actually changed the program. In our case, we were lucky enough that how they changed the program wasn't done in a way that actually torpedoed our study, but they could have. They could have put on a music program, for example, or they could have put on a program that was very similar to Le Forum, and it would have made it very difficult to compare the two. So I'm happy, again, to talk in the Q&A if people want to hear that tale, because it's something unexpected that came up, but something that you should be aware of. So as I said before, in closing, I think there's some opportunities in the future to use this kind of evaluation strategy, particularly with regards to media-based programming. In fact, we just found out that Arundel was lucky enough to get some funding for us to collaborate on an evaluation of a project that they have in Madagascar now, of a new youth-based media program. So we're excited to be able to do that evaluation with the tweak of this strategy in the coming months. So with that, I'm happy to respond to questions, comments, critiques, concerns that people have. And I want to thank you again for this opportunity.
Jeff, thank you so much for such a detailed presentation. I know that the audience are eagerly awaiting their opportunity to ask questions. So to our audience, this is your time to shine. A couple of notes about our format for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Thursday Talks. You can submit a question in 2 ways. The first is through the question function, which will allow you to type your question, as many of you have done so far. The second is to click on the little hand icon, which will raise your hand and allow us to unmute your microphone so you can ask your question live. When you do submit your question, we ask that you submit your name and affiliation so that we have a bit more context about where you're coming from. Just to note, these talks are recorded and posted on DME for Peace, so those who are not able to join us at this time can go back and listen to the presentation and the discussion. Now, Jeff, a number of people have followed up on your earlier question, which you raised in the presentation. Why did you include a control group?
Great, yeah, that's a great question. I actually have a slide prepared for that. There are really 2 reasons to include a control group, and I originally wasn't planning to, and then I got some feedback from a great group of scholars who do experiments that it could be really helpful to include a control group. And that's because if we're only comparing the program of focus to the placebo, if those are our only groups, then what we're really talking about is what are the effects of your programming, the programming that you're interested in, relative to the placebo. And so therefore, the effects of the placebo become really important. So you could imagine a situation in which your programming, the programming that you're interested in, has similar kinds of affects people in similar ways to the placebo, right? And so then when you compare your programming to the placebo, then what you find, you might see no effect, right? There's no difference between the two, when in reality, your program was actually having an effect. I could give you an opposite example of, let's say your programming actually isn't having any effect, but the placebo program is, and it's having an effect in the opposite direction of what you'd intended, right? And so then you could look at your, you could look at the comparison between your programming and the placebo, and you could see that there's a big difference between the two, and therefore your program is actually being effective when it's really not. It's the placebo that's actually doing all the quote unquote work. So having that control group there allows you to compare your group, the group of interest, to the control condition, but also that placebo condition, that you're confident that those people are not, if they're complying, are not being exposed to the program at all. The other reason why we included a control group is that one possible argument would be that, well, okay, the effects that you're seeing are just because people are listening to the radio more, right? Or in our case, it was radio. It could be television, right? And so we wanted to have that other sort of condition there to allow us to rule out that kind of possibility.
Great, thank you, Jeff. We have a raised hand in the audience from my friend and colleague Lauren Cassindi at Search for Common Ground. And Laurent, I have unmuted your microphone, so you are self-muted. If you want to unmute yourself, you can ask your question live.
Okay, thank you very much. I just have a very small question. Is how do you consider the popularity of the placebo compared to the focus program? I can imagine a situation where the placebo program is less popular or less preferred than the focus program, and in that situation, as you are assigning the role randomly, I just can see a situation where a young listener, for example, is assigned a placebo role, but to a radio station that they don't like, and they don't necessarily want to listen to. I'm just wondering if you took that in consideration, and if you see a risk in that situation that it can affect the results of the study.
Yeah, that's a tremendous question. And to be honest, when we were going out looking for placebo programs, there were so many challenges with identifying the perfect placebo that the popularity of the program didn't really come into consideration. But it clearly should have, and I'll tell you why. I mean, it did come into consideration in the sense that we didn't want to choose a placebo that people would say, I really have no interest in listening to this kind of program, and then they wouldn't comply, or they wouldn't comply unless we offered very substantial financial incentives. So we wanted something that was, it's probably a good idea in retrospect to have something that is of a similar level of popularity that you expect the program of focus to have. And this is where having a lot of background knowledge would be helpful. So if you have data, as imperfect as it is, audience surveys about the relative popularity of different stations, that could help you. I think it's a good idea not to err on the side of either extreme, right? To choose a placebo program that's extremely unpopular, because then it's going to be really hard to incentivize people to listen to it, because there probably is a good reason why they're not listening to it or watching it. This could be done with television too, of course. On the other hand, I would be very wary of choosing something that's extremely popular, because then the people who are not assigned to the placebo, who are assigned to the the treatment one, the program that you're primarily interested in, a large proportion of them are going to find it very difficult not to watch that program or listen to that program because it's something that they really like, which is evidenced by the popularity of the program. And so you're going to have people who are assigned to the first treatment also not complying. So I think if you have options, it's best to go with like programs that are at sort of moderate levels of popularity, because I think that's the best way to get high levels of compliance.
Great, thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Lauren, for a great question. Our next question comes from Alistair Stewart of BBC Media Action and also a former guest of the Thursday Talks. Alistair writes, one downside of an encouragement design is that it may prompt listeners or viewers to engage with the program more activity than natural listenership or viewership, as they know they've been asked to listen to or watch it. Are there ways to deal with this encouragement effect in your analysis of the level of impact a program has had?
That's a great question, Alistair, and I should give a public thanks to BBC Media Action for supporting some of the other experimental work we did on media effects a good number of years ago by this point, but I think it's a great organization, obviously. So that's a great question. It gets at the heart of that statement I made about there's no perfect kind of evaluation design, right? So I think if it's a choice between doing an encouragement design and doing a laboratory study, like all else being equal, I think an encouragement design is better, because in a laboratory study, which is very common when you're trying to evaluate media effects, I just finished one up in Central Africa, the subjects are very aware that they're being included in some study usually, and they might be hypersensitive to the messages and very participatory in ways that they wouldn't normally be in the real world. And so you have that same problem that you have with encouragement designs, but at least with the encouragement design, the way in which they're being exposed to the program is a little more naturalistic, because they're not being brought into a quote unquote laboratory and have headphones put on them and say pay close attention to what you're listening to or what you're watching. I think there could be ways to mitigate some of these effects. And I think one of those ways is to try to downplay as much as possible, and as much as is ethical to do so, exactly what you think people are going to get out of listening to or watching the program. You don't want to transmit that too much, because that will sort of prime the subjects to respond in a particular way, and you certainly don't want that. And so this is one of the reasons why you might not want to do a baseline study, because a baseline study asks lots of questions that might prime people to, okay, what's the whole point of this? What am I supposed to be getting out of this? And only do an end-line study. For the project in Niger, we did do a baseline and an end-line. That's often advisable because it just helps you get more precision in your estimates of effects. You don't have to include as many subjects when you do a baseline and end-line. There are technical reasons why you want to do a baseline. But I would say anything that you can do to minimize the subject's ability to guess what you want them particularly to get out of listening to this program or watching this program is going to help. That said, if one can do a really quote unquote natural field experiment to gauge the effects of exposure to media, I think those are the best options. And that would go beyond an encouragement design. So if you can randomize which stations play a particular program, that is great. That's oftentimes not very feasible. Though I've only seen that done in a rare number of circumstances, and in a small country, for example, that's virtually impossible to do. The other strategy would be to use different kinds of field experiments. So I mentioned before the project that I did with a co-author, Deborah Moeller, who's then at the University of Pennsylvania, where BBC Media Action supported our research in Ghana because we were interested in measuring effects of exposure to partisan radio stations in that country. And so we didn't want to bring people into a laboratory, and we didn't want to do an encouragement design. So we worked with drivers of public transport vehicles to play certain stations, to randomize the stations that they played during morning commutes, and then we interviewed passengers after, and so we could estimate the effects of listening to one kind of partisan station versus another kind, versus a sort of a nonpartisan program versus a control. Those kinds of opportunities are often quite limited, and they don't help you if you want to measure the sort of repeated exposure to a program. It's really more of a one-size thing. So I guess my short answer after a very long answer would be there is no perfect way to do this. Something that gives you an advantage in one way is often a disadvantage in another way.
Great. Alistair, thank you for your question, and Jeff for your detailed answer. I'm going to use my moderator's privilege here because there have been quite a few questions on the incentives aspect of this kind of design. So one of the things that's become clear is that, you know, remuneration is a great incentive, obviously. But did you guys consider any other kind of incentives apart from remuneration? Obviously, that isn't possible in every program. So I think it'd be really helpful for our audience to know about other incentives you may have considered.
Yeah, that's also a great question. I think my mind went straight to money. Well, I think I can't remember if we actually ended up using mobile money or phone credits transfer. There were logistical issues that led us to choose one over the other. But that probably tells you something about me. My mind went to people are most motivated by money. And, you know, in our cases, they weren't large amounts of money. I believe it was like the equivalent of $1.70 US for answering, for getting enough questions right for one quiz. And we also gave financial incentives for completing the baseline. Because we wanted people to know we were really serious about this, and we were putting our money where our mouth was. And we gave the largest payment for people completing the end line because we were really concerned about attrition. And I know there's a lot of different thoughts out there about the pros and cons of remunerating subjects in this kind of way. But I just wasn't confident that we could get people to participate and to comply without it. Other kinds of options that you could do, and you really have to vary this by setting, right? In some settings, it might be worthwhile to consider that people are entered in some kind of lottery, for example, and maybe there's going to be one kind of prize that's given out at the end, and so the more questions they get right, the more chances they have to win the prize. Frankly, I've only seen an encouragement design done with more direct financial incentives, so I don't know how well that would work, and I think it would work better in some contexts than in others. You could theoretically do an encouragement design without any kind of incentivization. In that instance, it would be kind of a publicity campaign where you randomly send publicity to some subjects and randomly send publicity about an alternate program, a placebo program, to other subjects, and then maybe you have a control group that doesn't get any kind of publicity. That's a design that I have considered in the past. I've never implemented it, but I would be surprised if other people haven't tried to implement that. Maybe not with media, but with other kinds of strategies, like getting people to attend grassroots activities or things like that. So I don't want to say that you have to pay the subjects, but I'm skeptical about whether a design can really get compliance if you're not offering people something material in return.
Great, thank you, Jeff. As we're nearly at time, I just want to squeeze in one last question. I also want to apologize to the audience. We have had a ton of questions today that we're not able to get through, but as long as it's okay with Jeff, he has his email on the screen if there's anything particularly pressing that you can email him afterwards. So a final question comes from Nicola, who is at Kalisa, and Nicola writes, how effective is symmetric encouragement design in measuring the effects of digital media, or is it only relevant to broadcast exposure?
Oh, that's a tremendous question. I think it's a great question because I don't have a good answer to how you could use an encouragement design with digital media, because it's so hard to imagine how you could create a clean treatment group and then a placebo group in which people are not exposed to that digital media because it's not the content isn't time sensitive, right? It's not going to disappear the way that broadcast content often does. But I should say that this kind of design won't work in environments in which like lots of people can stream whatever media content they want whenever they want. For example, Le Forum, you can go online right now and stream any of their audio. We were working in a rural, very impoverished area, and so it's extremely unlikely that any of our subjects were going to do that. But once you get into the digital realm, this becomes more challenging. So I think you can do a kind of, I'm just speaking off the top of my head, I hadn't thought about this before, but you could do a kind of symmetric encouragement design where you encourage people to check out one kind of digital media source and then encourage other people to check out another kind of digital media source. And in that sense, it's kind of a publicity, again, kind of campaign where you're trying to raise awareness of one source and you're also trying to raise awareness of another source that the logic here might be a little faulty, but you could imagine people have limited time that they can spend online and limited resources that they can devote to that. So any time that they spend on this other site is less time that they can spend on the site that you're interested in. So if it is effective, you're artificially increasing exposure to one kind of digital media messaging and artificially decreasing exposure from another group. I can't think of the top of my head anyone who's tried to do this. I'm not sure how it would actually work, but I'm fairly confident that you could at least attempt it, and it's an intriguing possibility.
Jeff, thank you so much for being a wonderful guest today and handling the Q&A. Handling all the questions in such detail. I really appreciated it, and I'm sure our audience did. And thank you for a great presentation once again. And to our audience, you guys were brilliant. Thanks again for participating in another Thursday Talk webinar. This wouldn't be the same without your engagement, and I really appreciate your continued support for these webinars and for the DME for Peace platform. I know we didn't get to discuss all the questions today, but I encourage you to return to the recording of this webinar and continue the discussion in the comments. Our community has a lot to learn and a lot to learn from each other. So the recording of this webinar will be posted on the DME for Peace website today. So get at it. Send it to your colleagues. Continue the discussion. We'll be back in a few weeks with another Thursday Talk webinar. But in the meantime, thank you very much, Jeff. Thank you to our audience, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week.